The boardroom was silent. Not the silence of an empty room, the silence of 12 people who have decided, each in their own way, that something is about to happen, and who are waiting to see exactly how it unfolds. I stood at the head of the table for a full 5 seconds before anyone acknowledged me. In 45 years of business, I had never stood at the head of any table and not been acknowledged immediately. That had always simply been the way of things. You walk in, the room notices. It is not arrogance. It is the accumulated weight of a life spent being responsible for what happens next. That morning, for the first time, the room did not immediately notice me. 12 people sat around that long table. People I had known for decades. People whose careers I had built from the ground up. Men and women I had hired personally. Promoted personally. Defended when others questioned them. Championed when they needed championing. People who had eaten at my table. People who had attended my wife's funeral and pressed my hand at the graveside and said the things people say when a man loses the most important person in his life. People who had shaken my hand at the opening of every new building this company had ever put its name on. 12 people who had, collectively, received more from me than perhaps they fully remembered. And every single one of them was looking at my son. Not at me. At my son. Kwame sat at the far end of the table with his leather portfolio open in front of him, calm as still water, as though the chair he was sitting in had always been his, as though the room had always been his, as though the 45 years I had poured into every corner of this company were simply a prologue to his story, a long, necessary introduction to the real narrative, which began with him. He had not stolen from me with violence. He had not threatened me or made demands or arrived in my study one evening to deliver an ultimatum. He had done something far more sophisticated, far more patient, and in some ways far more difficult to defend against than any of those things. He had simply, quietly, patiently, paperwork by paperwork, conversation by conversation, relationship by relationship, begun to erase me. Not all at once, never all at once. Erasure, when it is done skillfully, does not announce itself. It accumulates. It arrives in layers so thin that each one, examined individually, seems almost reasonable. An administrative adjustment, a scheduling decision made on your behalf, a name updated in a database, a meeting held without you because the topic was technical and your time was valuable. Each one small enough to explain. Each one, when combined with the next, building towards something that could not be explained away at all. And he almost succeeded. Before I tell you what happened in that room, before I tell you how 4 hours and 20 minutes of difficult truth changed the direction of everything I had spent a lifetime building, I need to take you back past the board meeting, past the 5 days of careful performance that preceded it, past the attorney's office and the legal folders and the moment I looked at my own signature on a document I had not properly read. I need to take you all the way back to the beginning. Because without the beginning, none of what came after makes the kind of sense that actually teaches you something. Before I tell you what happened next, I need to ask you something. Where are you watching this from right now? Are you in Nigeria, the UK, the US, Ghana, South Africa, somewhere else entirely? Drop it in the comments below. I genuinely want to know where these stories are landing, whose hands they are reaching, and if what you are about to hear speaks to something real inside you, something you have lived or witnessed, or perhaps feared. Please take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It costs you nothing, and it means more than I can properly explain. Now, let me take you back to where this all began. My name is Emmanuel Osei. I am 71 years old. And for most of my adult life, certainly for the years that mattered most, I believed that the greatest thing a man could leave behind was not money, it was character. I know how that sounds. I know that it can sound like the kind of thing a wealthy man says because he has already secured the money and can afford to be philosophical about it. But I was saying it before the money came. I was saying it when I was 26 years old, with almost nothing in my pockets and everything in my intentions. I said it because I had seen it demonstrated, with my own eyes, by someone who had very little and yet left behind something enormous. I was born the third son of a trader in a city that was still finding its shape. A city that was noisy and ambitious and perpetually under construction, not just in its buildings, but in its character, its commerce, its sense of what it was becoming. Every street felt provisional in those years. Every business felt like a bet placed on a future that had not yet declared its intention. My father sold fabric from a stall in the market. It was not a grand market. It was the kind of market that smelled of dye and sawdust and the particular warm density that comes from many people moving through a small space with purpose. His stall was at the inner end of the second row, which was not the best position, but was not the worst. He had learned, over years, how to make his position work for him. My father sold fabric from a stall that smelled of dye and sawdust. He was not a wealthy man, but he was a precise one. He kept his accounts in a small green notebook that he wrote in every evening after closing. For sitting at the kitchen table under a single bulb, his handwriting so small and careful that you had to lean close to read it. He never missed an evening, rain or heat, tired or well, whether the day had been good or the day had been the kind that makes a man question his choices. Every evening, the notebook came out, the pen came out, and the numbers were recorded. Not because he needed to record them. He could have held them in his head well enough. He did it because he believed that a thing not written down did not fully exist. That the act of recording was itself a form of respect for the effort that produced the number and for the future that would need to understand it. I used to sit beside him sometimes and watch. I did not understand the numbers. I was young. Bomi and the columns of figures meant very little to me in any practical sense, but I understood something else. I understood the discipline, the idea that at the end of every day, regardless of what the day had brought, a man should know exactly where he stood. Not approximately, exactly. That notebook was the first business education I ever received. Not because of what was in it, though what was in it was useful, but because of the habit it represented, the commitment to clarity, the refusal to let the comfortable fog of vague knowing substitute for the sharp light of actual knowing. It took me several decades to understand how rare that quality is. Most people, in business and in life, prefer the fog. The fog is comfortable. The fog means you do not have to confront the precise gap between what you intended and what actually happened. My father had no patience for the fog. He burned it off every evening with his small, careful pen. I finished secondary school with marks that surprised some of my teachers, though they did not surprise me, because I had watched my father approach his work and understood that attention, consistently applied, tends to produce results. I won a partial scholarship to study economics at the university in the capital. My father paid the rest from savings he had been accumulating for 3 years without telling any of us. He had simply decided, at some point, that this was the investment his family most needed, and he had arranged for it quietly and without complaint. He did not make a show of it when I found out. He seemed almost embarrassed by my gratitude, as though it had only been a reasonable thing to do, and I was overcomplicating it with emotion. The morning I left for the city, he came with me to the bus station. My mother was there too, and 2 of my brothers, and there was the kind of noise and movement that surrounds departures in our part of the world. Vendors, bags, voices, the diesel smell of engines warming up. In the middle of all of it, my father pressed a sealed envelope into my hand. He was not a man who said unnecessary things. He had a gift for compression. He could say in 4 words what other men needed a paragraph for. He looked at me in that way he had, the level, steady look, and said simply, "Open it when you arrive." My father paid the rest from savings he had been accumulating for 3 years without telling any of us. The envelope contained enough money for 2 months of expenses, carefully calculated, I would later understand, to give me time to find my feet without the desperation of an immediate deadline pressing down on everything I did. He had thought it through. He always thought things through. Inside the envelope, alongside the money, was a single sheet of paper folded once. In that small, careful handwriting that I would have known anywhere, a single sentence. It said, "Everything you build should be able to outlast you." I read it sitting on the bus as it pulled away from the station. I read it 3 times. I am not sure I fully understood it then. Not all of it. I understood the surface of it. I did not yet understand the depth. That depth would take me 45 years to reach. I kept that piece of paper for 40 years. Through every office move, every expansion, every point at which the company changed its shape, or its name or its ambitions, that piece of paper came with me. It lived in the inner pocket of whatever portfolio or briefcase I was carrying. It was not a superstition. It was a compass. Whenever I was about to make a decision that felt important, and over 45 years, there were many of those, I would find a moment of quiet and ask myself whether the decision honored that sentence, whether what I was building could outlast me. Not just the structure, the values inside the structure. Sometimes the answer was easy. Sometimes it was the hardest question in the room. After university, I worked for 4 years at a trading firm in the capital. It was a good firm, established, well-connected, but run by men who understood how commerce actually moved rather than how textbooks said it should. I was grateful for the position. I was more grateful for the education. I learned how goods moved, how money followed movement, how a deal was never really about the product being exchanged. It was always, underneath everything, about whether two parties trusted each other enough to make themselves vulnerable to the other's word. Trust, properly managed, was worth more than any single transaction. I had understood this intellectually from my father's example. I began to understand it practically in those 4 years at the trading firm. I was not the most talented person in that office. I should be honest about that. There were men there with sharper analytical minds, faster instincts, better instincts for reading a room in real time. I was not at the top of the rankings, if there had been rankings, but I was probably the most observant. I watched everything. I remembered everything. I noticed which relationships produced which outcomes over time. I noticed which men's handshakes meant something and which ones were mere formality. I noticed the way a particular managing director held his body differently when he was genuinely interested versus when he was being politely patient. I built, over those 4 years, a model of how the world of commerce actually worked. The real world, underneath the visible one. And when I finally left to start something of my own, I took with me not money. I had very little, but that understanding. It would prove worth considerably more than capital. I started Osei Holdings at 26. It was not called that then, but it was called Emmanuel General Trading, which my wife Abena, whom I had not yet met when I chose the name, would later say sounded like a man who had not yet decided what he wanted to be. She was right. The name was provisional in the same way the earliest version of the company was provisional, capable, functional, and not yet fully itself. The name changed 3 years later, when I finally understood that what I was building was not a company but a structure. Something with layers, something designed to last. Osei Holdings reflected that intention, the word holdings carrying within it the idea of something being kept, preserved, protected over time against the forces that erode things. I chose that name the same week I first read my father's sentence for what I now understand was the first time I actually understood it. When everything you build should be able to outlast you. A holding company, by its nature, is built to hold, to persist, to outlast the individual decisions of any particular day or year. It felt like the right container for the right intention. Abena. I should tell you about Abena. We met at a dinner hosted by a mutual friend 6 months after I started the business. I was distracted that evening. There was a supplier dispute I had not yet resolved and a financing conversation I was still preparing for, and I arrived with part of my mind already elsewhere. I sat through the early part of the dinner in that half-present way that busy people sometimes occupy social occasions, listening with one ear while the other ear was still in the office. She was a secondary school teacher at the time, quiet in large groups, but sharply funny in small ones. She had a way of watching people across a room that made you feel, when her eyes finally landed on you, that she had already decided something important. Not judgment, not the cold kind. More like the assessment of someone who genuinely sees people and is not easily fooled by the version of themselves they choose to present. She decided something important about me that night. I did not find out what it was until the 3rd time we met. We had encountered each other twice more through that same circle of mutual acquaintances, when she told me plainly, in the way she had of being plain, that she thought I was working too hard for someone who did not yet know why he was working. It was not a kind thing to say to a man who was trying to build something from very little. It was also not unkind. It was precise. The way a well-aimed observation is precise. It lands where it was meant to land, and it stays there. I told her I was building something. She asked me what. I said security. She tilted her head slightly. I would come to know that gesture well over the following decades, the slight sideways tilt that meant she was about to ask the question you had not thought to ask yourself, and she said, "Security for who?" I had no answer. Not a real one. I had the shape of an answer. Something about the future, something about family, but I could not make it precise enough to say aloud, and Abena, I would learn, had very little patience for things that could not be made precise. That question, security for who? became the question that shaped the next 40 years of my life. Not because I found a simple answer, but because the act of keeping it alive, of returning to it every time a major decision needed to be made, kept me honest in a way that I might not otherwise have been. Business is very good at providing justifications for whatever you have already decided you want. A good question is the only reliable counterweight to a convenient justification. Abena was, among many things, a very good question. We married when I was 29. The wedding was held in the compound of her parents' home, which was in the neighborhood where she had grown up, and it was the kind of occasion that those of us who were there still speak of differently than we speak of other occasions. Not because it was the most elaborate thing any of us had attended, but because there was something in the air that day that felt deliberately true, like a decision made carefully and held to completely. Kwame was born the following year. He was a serious baby, watchful, less interested in the noise and movement of his environment than in studying it. Even then, you could see the quality that would define him. The attention, the careful noting. Daniel came 6 years after that, by which time the business had found its footing and we had moved from a rented apartment to the house where I still live today. Daniel came 6 years after that, by which time the business had found its footing and we had moved from a rented apartment to the house where I still live today. The house has a garden that Abena designed herself over 3 years, adjusting, adding, removing, treating the garden the way she treated most things, as a project that rewarded patience and penalized haste. I have not changed it since she died. I tend it, as faithfully as I'm able, in the way she would have wanted it tended. The house is not extravagant by the standards of what the business eventually became. Abena never wanted extravagance. She wanted space for a garden and enough rooms for family to visit comfortably. We had both. And for a long time, for the years when the boys were young and the business was growing and Abena was still correcting examination papers at the kitchen table at 10 in the evening, that felt like exactly enough, more than enough. It felt like the precise right amount of a life. Both boys grew up inside this house and inside this business. Not literally. I was careful to protect their childhood from the pressure of what I was building. I had seen, in the families of other men I knew, what happened when a patriarch made his children feel that the business was the primary reality and the family was a secondary consideration. It produced a particular kind of damage that showed up years later in the children's relationships with work and with each other, in ways that were difficult to trace back to the source but impossible to miss once you knew what you were looking at. So I was deliberate about the boundary. Work stayed at work as much as it could. The dinner table was for conversation that did not require a quarterly report to follow it. The weekends, when the boys were small, belonged to the family rather than to the office, but they breathed the atmosphere of it. They heard the dinner table conversations. They watched me take calls at odd hours. They saw what it looked like when a deal fell through, the particular stillness that comes over a man who has lost something he worked hard for. And they saw what it looked like when one came together, which is something closer to quiet satisfaction than to celebration, if you are doing it right. Kwame absorbed it all like a student. From a young age, he asked questions that surprised me. Not child questions. Real questions. The kind that come from someone who has been listening carefully and wants to understand what they heard. Not just be told what they should think. At 14, he asked me once why I had chosen a particular bank for our operating accounts when another institution was offering better rates. I had not mentioned this to either of the boys. He had heard it, apparently, in a phone call I had taken in the study with the door not fully closed. And instead of letting it pass, the way most 14-year-olds would let a fragment of business conversation pass, he had held onto it and brought it to me at the right moment. I told him the rates were not the only consideration, that relationships with institutions, built over time, were worth more than short-term advantages. That a bank which knows your history and trusts your judgment is an asset that does not show up on any balance sheet but is worth more, in a difficult year, than a percentage point of interest. He nodded and wrote something in a small notebook he carried everywhere that year. I remember noticing the notebook. It reminded me of my father's green accounting book, and feeling something I did not immediately name, but which I now recognize as a complicated kind of pride. The pride of a man who sees something of himself in someone he loves, mixed with something more cautious that he does not yet know to call caution. I remember thinking, this boy is going to be formidable. I was right. That was never the part where I was wrong. Daniel was different. He was quieter, more interior. He loved to read and had a particular gift for language that sometimes startled me when it appeared in his school reports. His teachers described him as perceptive, empathetic, unusually good at understanding what people were not saying. That last quality is rarer than most people realize. The world teaches us to read what is said. The world gives very few people the instinct to hear what is withheld. Daniel had it naturally, not as a skill he had cultivated, but as something built into the way he perceived situations. He noticed the pause before an answer. He noticed when someone's words and their body were pointing in different directions. He noticed what was missing from a room as readily as what was present in it. I valued that quality in him even when I did not fully understand it. It made me slightly uncomfortable sometimes, if I am honest. Men who are good at reading what is not said have a tendency to read you too. And I had, like most men of my generation, developed a habit of keeping certain things within a comfortable inner distance from examination. Abena used to say that Kwame would run the company and Daniel would keep it honest. But she said it lightly, as a joke. The kind of joke that arrives easily in a family where everyone is comfortable enough to be a little irreverent about the things they love. But I have thought about it many times since then, and I no longer believe she was entirely joking. Abena had a long habit of saying true things in the register of lightness. She had learned, I think, that truth delivered directly sometimes causes people to flinch and look away, whereas truth delivered at an angle tends to land and stay. She was a teacher for 30 years. She understood how to get something into a person that they would carry without knowing they were carrying it. She got a lot of things into me that way. I am still finding them. Kwame went to study business abroad. He chose his program carefully. He had researched it over 2 years, which I did not discover until later, and selected it on the basis of specific faculty members whose work he had been reading since he was 17. That was characteristic. He never made an important choice without first making it an informed one. He was away for 3 years. He called regularly. He asked questions about the business during those calls. Not the surface questions, but the structural ones, the ones that showed he had been thinking about them between conversations. He came back different in the way people come back from extended exposure to a different world, more polished in certain ways, more confident, with a slightly altered grammar of thought. He came back polished, articulate, and visibly hungry. I gave him a junior director role and watched him work. He was excellent, focused, but he could read a room the way I once could and make decisions with a confidence that came from preparation rather than arrogance, or so it appeared. There is a difference between those two, and it matters enormously, but from the outside they can look alike when someone is performing well. It takes time, and it takes a particular kind of attention to see which one you are actually dealing with. He had instincts for relationships that I recognized. He built trust quickly. He was generous with credit when things went right, and measured in his response when they did not. The people who worked for him respected him. Some of them, the younger ones especially, seemed to admire him in a way that went slightly beyond professional respect into something more personal. He attracted loyalty the way certain people do, effortlessly, by being exactly what they appear to be when people most need them to be something. I was proud of him. I told him so. Not often enough. That is one of the things I would change if I could walk those years back and live them again. I told him, but not in the frequency or the directness that he probably needed. I am of a generation that considers excessive praise a kind of weakness, a softening of the necessary edge. I know now that this is not wisdom. It is simply a fear of vulnerability dressed up as principle. I told him I was proud of him, but I did not tell him often enough, and I did not tell him fully enough. And the gap between what I felt and what I expressed became, over years, a space in which other things grew. Daniel spent 2 years after university working with a non-profit that ran literacy programs in rural communities. I did not ask him to come into the business. This was a deliberate decision. I had watched too many men force their sons into their companies like molds they were expected to fill, and I had seen what the pressure produced: resentment, half-heartedness, or, worse, a performance of enthusiasm that fooled everyone except the person performing it. I waited. I gave Daniel space. I trusted that if the company was right for him, he would find his way to it without being pushed. And if it was not right for him, I wanted him to know that I valued his honesty about that more than I valued his compliance. He worked in those rural communities for 2 years and came back with something that money could not have given him: a direct experience of what it meant to need things and not have access to them. That experience made him In some ways that were not immediately visible. A better person for the company to have than any particular technical qualification would have. When he finally came to me and said he wanted to join, I asked him why. He thought for a moment. Daniel always thought before answering, which was one of the things that distinguished him from his brother in a way that was easy to overlook, and said, "Because I want to understand what you built before it belongs to someone else." It was an unusual answer. I have thought about it often since. It contained several things at once: a genuine desire to understand, an acknowledgement that the company's ownership would eventually change, and something else, something I did not quite catch at the time, about the importance of that understanding happening now, before the handover, rather than after it. As if he already sensed, at some level I was not ready to name, that the handover itself would require someone who actually knew what was being handed. I gave him a role in the community investment division. He was good at it, better than good. He had a way with people, with the communities we worked with the local organizations we partnered with the staff in that department, that built loyalty quietly and without effort. The kind of loyalty that does not leave when circumstances change. The kind that is built on genuine regard rather than on the expectation of reward. I watched both my sons settle into their roles in the company, and I believed, with something that felt like certainty but was closer to hope, that I had built the foundation of something that would last. I was right about the foundation. I was wrong about what it would require to protect it. Abina died 7 years ago. It was a short illness, the kind that moves faster than the doctors expect and faster than the family is ever prepared for. She was 62 years old. She had been planning to retire from teaching that same year, not because she had lost her love for it, but because she had been talking for several years about wanting more time for the garden, more time for the grandchildren she hoped would arrive soon, more time simply to be in the world without a schedule pressing down on every hour. She never got that time. The night she passed, I sat alone in this study until morning. I did not cry immediately. I am not sure I fully understood yet that she was gone. Not in the way the body understands, not in the cellular, yinny irrefutable way that grief eventually makes itself known. I simply sat with the silence, listening to the house settle around me in the dark, trying to find some version of the next day that made sense. Every version I constructed required a Bana to be in it. I could not build a next day that did not include her. I did not know how. It took me a long time to find it. It took me much longer than I admitted to anyone, including myself. Grief changes a man. Not all at once. There is no single moment of transformation that you can point to and say, there, that is where it happened. It changes you slowly, over months and years, rearranging what you care about the way water rearranges sand, not dramatically, not in a way you can observe in real time, but decisively. When you finally look up and notice the new configuration, one you cannot quite remember when the change began. The things that felt urgent before feel less so. The things he took for granted become enormous. The whole scale of what matters recalibrates around a new center, one that is defined by absence rather than presence. A coffee cup in the same spot it was always kept. The sound of a particular door closing. Not the sound itself, but the expectation of what usually followed it. The footsteps and the voice that no longer came after. The absence of a voice in a room that used to be full of one. These were the things that undid me in the months after she died, not the large occasions, not the anniversaries or the holidays, but the small daily moments when the world went on in the way it always had, and she was simply, without explanation, not there. I became quieter after Abena died. I spent more time in the study. My conversations at the office became more purposeful and less exploratory. I had less patience for the kind of conversation that does not know where it is going, and I began thinking, more seriously than I ever had before, about what would happen to everything I had built when I was no longer here to manage it. Succession had always been an abstract thought, the kind of long-range planning that a responsible person keeps somewhere on the horizon without bringing it into the room. After Abena died, it became concrete and urgent. Mortality, which I had always intellectually acknowledged, had become personal. The future had become finite. The question of what I was building for had become inseparable from the question of how long I had to build. I began having conversations with both boys about transition, about what the company would look like in 20 years, about who would be responsible for carrying it there, and what kind of preparation that responsibility required. Kwame listened to these conversations with an attentiveness that I found reassuring. He asked thoughtful questions. He offered ideas that showed he had been thinking about the company's future independently, not just in response to what I raised. He seemed to understand the weight of what I was describing. The responsibility, the complexity, the way a business of this scale carried within it the livelihoods of hundreds of people and the legacies of decisions made across 4 decades. He seemed ready. That was my honest assessment at the time. He seemed like a man who had been preparing for something large and had finally been given explicit permission to acknowledge it. Wait, looking back now, I understand that he was doing something else entirely. He was measuring the distance between where he was and where he intended to be. He was calculating what remained between himself and the destination he had already chosen. He was listening to me describe the handover. And he was already deciding that the handover was taking too long. And he was planning the route. I do not say this to condemn him, or not yet. Condemnation requires context, and the context was not simple. I say it because understanding what he was doing and why is the only way to understand what had to happen to stop it. A man who is afraid of being left behind will sometimes move before he is supposed to, and fear, in the hands of an intelligent and capable person, can produce plans of considerable sophistication. The first sign came 18 months ago, though I did not recognize it as a sign at the time. I was reviewing quarterly reports in the study one Wednesday morning when Margaret, my personal assistant of 22 years, a woman whose judgment I trust more than most people in this company, knocked on the door with an expression I knew well, the careful one, the one she wears when she has something to say that she would rather not have to say. Margaret had been with me long enough to know that I was not a man who needed information managed before it reached me. I did not need difficult news softened. I needed it accurate and complete. She knew this, and so the expression she wore when she had something uncomfortable to deliver was not the expression of a woman preparing to cushion a blow. It was the expression of a woman choosing her words carefully because the words matter. She said that the Thursday meeting for the Kingsway Tower project had been rescheduled. I asked who had rescheduled it. She placed her hands together in front of her, a gesture I associated with her most precise mode, and said it had been rescheduled by Mr. Kwam's office, that I would be briefed on the outcomes afterward. I held that information for a moment. Rescheduled by Kwam's office, and I would be briefed on the outcomes, as though I were a senior stakeholder being managed rather than the man who had originated the project, negotiated the land, managed the approvals, and carried the thing on his own back for 4 years. The Kingsway Tower was a project I had personally initiated. I had spent 4 years negotiating the land acquisition, still managing the zoning approvals, selecting the development partners, building the financial structure that made the whole thing viable. It was not a company project in the ordinary sense. It carried my personal investment and my personal oversight, and it was not something anyone rescheduled on my behalf without first asking. I asked Margaret to confirm the original meeting time directly with the project manager and inform him I would be there. She left without comment. That was one of the things I valued most about Margaret. She did not add her own interpretation to situations that had not asked for it. She gave me the information and let me draw my own conclusions. That evening I mentioned it to Kwame as we passed each other in the corridor. He smiled immediately, warm, relaxed. He said he had been trying to save me an unnecessary trip, that there were structural questions the engineers needed to resolve before the discussion was worth having at my level. He said it with such easy consideration, as though he were managing my comfort, as though efficiency and care were his only motivations. The explanation was seamless. I had heard him give explanations before, and they were always seamless. That was, I was beginning to understand, partly what made them difficult. I accepted the explanation. I was still in the process, which I now see was a longer process than I admitted, of adjusting to the idea of sharing authority, of releasing the instinct to be at the center of everything that mattered. Perhaps, I told myself, this is simply what a capable successor looks like in practice. Taking initiative, removing friction, protecting the founder from unnecessary involvement in things that could be handled at another level, but something small had moved inside me. Not alarm, not yet, something quieter, the particular small shift that happens when a pattern has not yet declared itself but is beginning to be legible. A question, not yet fully formed, about whether the efficiency and care were the whole story, or whether they were the visible surface of something with a different logic underneath. Over the following weeks, I noticed other things. A meeting with a real estate partner, that appeared in Kwame's calendar, but not mine, despite the fact that the relationship was mine originally. I had built it over a decade, through 3 separate projects. Through the particular slow accumulation of trust that certain categories of business relationship require, a revised proposal sent to a government contact I had cultivated over 15 years, a contact whose relationship with me was personal as much as professional, that carried Kwame's name in the correspondence header rather than mine. The government contact was a man named Ashimpong. We had known each other since before he reached his current position. His daughter had attended the same school as Daniel. I had attended the opening of his mother's house in his hometown, 3 hours from the capital, because he had invited me, and because I understood that the kind of relationship that holds through difficulty is built in moments that have nothing to do with business. And now his correspondence with the company was going through Kwame's office, and my name had moved from the header to a courtesy copy at the bottom of the chain. Each time I mentioned it, the explanation was smooth and unhurried, an oversight, an assumption, a well-intentioned attempt to streamline the flow of information in a company that was growing and needed cleaner processes. The explanations were never implausible. They were always delivered with the right tone, collaborative, not defensive, with a forward-looking quality that made dwelling on the individual incident seem like the less sophisticated response. I kept accepting the explanations, and I kept noticing, and the notebook that I had started keeping filled, slowly, with dates and names and the precise details of each conversation. Because I had learned from 40 years in business that patterns only become visible when you document them. A single anomaly is noise. 3 in the same direction are a signal. The Chamber of Commerce luncheon had been a fixture in my calendar for 27 years. I had attended every single one. It was not purely a social occasion. Nothing in my professional life had ever been purely social, and I had long stopped pretending otherwise, even to myself. Business in this city runs on relationships, and relationships require maintenance. You show up, you shake hands, you remember the name of a man's daughter and ask how she is progressing in her studies. You sit at tables with people who will, at some future point, be in a position to either remember you favorably or not. And you invest in being remembered favorably long before you need that investment to pay off. 27 years of attending that luncheon had produced relationships that were woven into the fabric of how this company functioned. The Kingsway Tower approvals had moved in part because of a conversation at that luncheon 3 years earlier. The Accra Road development had found its lead partner at a table in that room. The Chamber of Commerce luncheon was not a social luxury. It was infrastructure. When the invitation arrived that year, it was addressed to Kwame, not to both of us, not to Emmanuel Osei with Kwame Osei as a secondary contact, to Kwame alone as the named representative of Osei Holdings. I asked my driver to call the chamber directly and confirm. Sure, he came back to me with that careful manner that people adopt when the information they are carrying is uncomfortable. The slight formality of bearing news you know the recipient does not want to receive. The primary contact name on the Osei Holdings account had been updated, he said. He was not sure when. Several months ago, perhaps. I sat with that information for a full day before I raised it with Kwame. I wanted to be certain of my composure before I had the conversation. When I did, his surprise seemed genuine. An administrative update, he said. Someone in the office had probably made the change without thinking through the implications. He would have it corrected by the end of the week. He sounded sincere. The surprise seemed real, but that night, sitting in the study after the house had gone quiet, I thought about something my father used to say. He used to say that a man's intentions were visible in his preparations, not his explanations. Any man can explain something that has already happened. The quality of a man's preparation, the what and the when, and the how of what he arranged in advance, tells you considerably more about what he actually intended. Kwame was always very well prepared. I began keeping a record, not a dramatic one, not the kind you keep when you are building a legal case, with formal language and notarial stamps. Just a quiet notebook, small, the kind my father might have used, in which I wrote down the things I noticed, the dates, the names, the details of each conversation, the precise language that was used and the language that was conspicuously absent. It was a habit I had learned from 40 years of business. In the early days of Osei Holdings, I kept records of everything because I had no margin for error and no infrastructure to fall back on if something went wrong. As the company grew, I kept records because I had learned that the mind does not remember accurately under stress. It reconstructs, it smooths, it fills in the gaps in ways that tend to align with what the mind wants to have been true. The notebook was a correction for the mind's optimistic tendencies. 8 pages filled, and the signal was unmistakable. Kwame was not simply taking on more responsibility. He was doing something more deliberate, more architectural. He was gradually, carefully, systematically repositioning himself as the center of the company, and repositioning me as a peripheral figure, a founder, an elder, someone whose name carried historical value and whose legacy deserved respect, but whose active authority was in the day-to-day reality of the company being quietly routed around. The process had a visible structure once you knew to look for it. First, you separate the founder from the relationships. The external contacts begin to hear from the successor instead of from the original. The predecessor's name moves from the correspondence header to the courtesy copy. Gradually, the external world begins to update its understanding of who, at this company, is the relevant person to know. Second, you create informational asymmetry. The founder no longer attends the meetings where real decisions are being shaped. He is briefed on outcomes, which means he receives the version of events that the briefer chooses to give him. He loses the ability to read the room in real time, to notice what is not being said, to catch the inflection in a voice that tells you something important about what is actually happening beneath the surface of what is being reported. Third, and most critically, you separate the founder from his sense of his own authority. You do this by consistently treating him as someone who needs to be managed, carefully, respectfully, even lovingly, rather than someone who needs to be included. Over time, if the founder accepts this treatment, he begins to accept the identity that the treatment implies. He becomes, not all at once but gradually, the man he is being treated as. Someone who used to run things, someone whose era is ending, someone who should be protected from the complexity he once mastered. He was creating a reality in which I was already retired, already secondary, already someone who needed things handled for him. And then acting consistently with that reality until the people around us began to accept it as true. I want to be precise about this because it matters. He was not stealing from me in any simple sense, not yet and not obviously. He was doing something more sophisticated, something that required, if you looked at it from a certain angle, a particular kind of intelligence and discipline. I recognized it because, in a different context and with different intentions, it was not entirely unlike what I myself had done in the early years of the business, slowly making myself indispensable, slowly shifting the center of gravity toward my own position, swaying until the people above me could not imagine the company without me at its center. I had done it without malice. I had done it with genuine belief in my own competence and genuine commitment to the company's future. And I had done it, in retrospect, without fully thinking through what it was doing to the people whose authority I was gradually absorbing. My son had been paying attention more carefully than I realized. It was Daniel who finally gave me the piece that changed everything. I had been watching him for several weeks. He seemed heavier somehow, not physically, but in the particular way that people carry difficult knowledge, with a slight extra weight in their movements, a carefulness in their pauses that was not entirely his usual carefulness. He had stopped coming to the study in the evenings the way he sometimes did, up to sit and talk about things that had nothing to do with business. When I saw him at the office, his manner was normal, professional, focused. But when we were in each other's company, without the office's context, there was something held back that had not been held back before. One Friday evening I asked him to come. He came. He sat. He looked at his hands for a moment, in the way people do when they are deciding, finally, to say a thing they have been holding for too long. And then he told me, Kwame had been holding meetings with the board. Without you. I asked what kind of meetings. He told me they were about the holding structure, about how certain assets were classified for governance purposes, about whether some of my direct personal holdings, properties I had held in my own name for more than a decade, the assets that formed part of the financial foundation Abina and I had built for our retirement and eventually our estate, should be formally moved into the corporate entity before the end of the fiscal year. The meetings had been presented to the board as a modernization exercise, a simplification of an unnecessarily complex structure. The language used was the language of efficiency, the kind of language that sounds neutral and forward-looking and practical, and that does not invite questions about motive because it does not seem to require motive. It is simply the rational thing to do, and who could argue with rationality? Most of the board members, Daniel told me, seemed to believe that I had endorsed the direction, that this was a transition I had agreed to, that the meetings were implementing something already decided rather than deciding something new. He mentioned a deadline, end of the current quarter. He told the board that having everything formalized before then would be, Daniel paused here, choosing his word with the care he always brought to words. Cleaner, cleaner. I held that word for a moment. Cleaner, the language of someone removing irregularities, the language of a man who had decided that the irregularity in the current situation was his father's continued presence at the center of what his father had built. Daniel looked at me with the tired, honest eyes he had inherited from his mother. He said, "I'm sorry, Dad. I should have told you sooner." I asked him why he hadn't. He was quiet for a long time, long enough that I did not push. And then he said, "Because I kept hoping I was wrong." He left shortly after, and I sat with the room for a long time. The house was quiet around me, the particular quality of quiet that a large house achieves after the last person has left it, when the silence seems to have a slight echo of all the voices it has recently absorbed. He just believes he is already in charge. Those words had been forming in my mind for weeks, a sentence I had been approaching from different angles without quite stating it directly to myself. But sitting alone in the study that Friday evening, I finally let myself say it clearly. He believes the transition is already complete. In his mind, he has already arrived. The only remaining variable is the formalization, the paperwork, the board resolutions, the transfers and reclassifications that will make the practical reality visible in the legal record. And he was moving to complete that formalization before anyone with the authority to stop it had the chance to intervene. Those words had been in my mind for weeks, but that night they took on a different weight, because now I understood something I had not fully understood before. Not just what Kwame was doing, but why. He did not believe he was betraying me. He believed he was managing a transition. In his mind, the future was already settled, and the only question was whether the present would catch up to it cleanly or awkwardly. He intended to ensure it happened cleanly, before I could do anything about it. I called Joseph Mensah early the next morning. Joseph had been my attorney for 31 years. While we had been through the full range of what a business life produces together, complex contracts, disputed partnerships, a hostile acquisition attempt in the 90s that we spent 18 months fighting and finally won, regulatory challenges that required precision and nerve in equal measure. He was methodical, unshakable, and deeply unfond of surprises. He was also, which was perhaps more important, a man who told me what was true rather than what I wanted to hear. When I told him what I needed, he was quiet for several seconds, the kind of silence he uses when he is organizing information rather than when he is absent. He asked how long Kwame had held signatory authority over the corporate accounts. 3 years, I told him. He asked whether my personal holdings, the Kingsway project, the Lakeview apartments, the Accra Road properties, remained in my name alone. They should, I said. There was a pause. Should, Joseph repeated. Just the word, nothing else. Come in this morning, he said, before you speak to anyone else. I drove to his office through streets that were still quiet with the particular stillness of very early morning. The city not yet fully in motion, the light clean and low and uncluttered. It is the hour I have always preferred for clear thinking. Everything feels more legible at that hour. The day has not yet accumulated its complications. Joseph's office had not changed in 3 decades. Dark wooden shelves arranged with a precision that reflected their owner's character. Files organized by a system I had never fully understood, but had always trusted completely. A photograph of his university graduating class on the wall. Alongside 2 or 3 framed professional recognitions that he had placed there, I always suspected, not out of vanity, but because clients should be able to see the credentials of the man they are trusting with their most important problems. A pot of tea already poured when I arrived, the way it always was. He had timed it to my arrival. He did not begin with pleasantries. He slid a folder across the desk. My team ran a search on property registrations last night, he said, after your call. I opened the folder. The first page was a summary document. Current ownership details on my major personal assets, formatted in the clean, economical language that legal documents use when they are delivering uncomfortable news. The Lakeview apartments, the Accra Road commercial complex, 2 properties I'd held in my own name for over a decade. Properties that had never been part of the corporate structure, that had always been personal assets, part of the financial foundation Abena and I had built for our retirement and, eventually, our estate. Properties whose names she had helped choose, whose tenants she had met, whose accounts she had reviewed each quarter because she believed that a person should understand all the parts of their own financial life, not delegate that understanding to someone else. Both were now listed under a subsidiary holding entity. I read the page twice, not because the words were difficult to understand, because the understanding itself required a moment's preparation. I asked when. Approximately 14 months ago, Joseph said. The transfers were processed through the corporate legal team. I asked on whose instruction. He turned to the next page of the folder. There is a power of attorney document, Emmanuel, he said, signed by you. For a moment I was certain I had misheard. I asked him to repeat it. He did. He said it exactly the same way the second time. I stared at the copy of the document in the folder. My signature was there at the bottom. I recognized it. Not just the signature itself, but the pen pressure, the particular way the letters of my name connected, something that is distinct to each person who has written the same name thousands of times. It was unambiguously mine. Joseph adjusted his glasses and explained. The document I had signed was a broad administrative authorization. It had been presented to me as a standard instrument, routine authority for Kwame to manage operational and administrative matters during my reduced schedule. The language was considerably broader than what one would ordinarily include in a purely operational authorization. It included authority over asset management decisions, and it had been drafted by Kwame's own legal team rather than by Joseph's office 2.5 years ago. I had been in a difficult period, the year after Abena died, when the grief was still thick and the ordinary business of living had a quality of effortfulness that I was not accustomed to. Everything required more energy than it should have. Simple decisions felt heavier than they were. I had reduced my hours at the office not because the business demanded it, but because I did not have the surplus that full presence requires. Kwame had come to me during that period with a stack of papers. He had explained, patiently and helpfully, that certain administrative processes needed to be streamlined, that my reduced presence was creating delays in routine matters, that a broad authorization would allow things to keep moving without requiring my constant attention. I had signed it. I had not read it carefully. I had trusted my son to describe it honestly. That trust was the mechanism. The trust was the thing he had used. And sitting in Joseph's office, reading my own signature on a document that had facilitated the movement of my personal assets into a structure I had not consented to, I felt something that I could not immediately name, something located between grief and recognition, the grief of a man who has been deceived, the recognition of a man who understands now that the deceiver is someone he loves. I asked what else there was. Why Joseph was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that precedes difficult information, not because the person is uncertain, but because they are being respectful about the weight of what they are about to say. Then he described the restructuring discussions Daniel had told me about. The intent, his team believed, was to move my remaining personal holdings into the corporate entity before the quarter closed. Once that transfer was complete, and it would be legally defensible under the existing power of attorney, my personal authority over those assets would be substantially diminished. And then, I asked, the board, which Kwame now had significant influence over through a combination of appointments made in the last 3 years and existing relationships, would control the future of those assets. My direct authority over the company's direction would be, in practical terms, nominal. The word Joseph used was nominal. He delivered it precisely, with no softening, because he knew I would not want it softened. I sat in that office for a long time after he finished speaking. I thought about the green notebook, about my father at the kitchen table under a single bulb, writing in his small, careful hand, about the sentence he had pressed into my palm at the bus station. Everything you build should be able to outlast you. I had spent 45 years trying to honor that sentence, and in 14 quiet months, working through documents I had trusted and relationships I had built, the instruments of that effort had been turned toward dismantling it. The very things I had created to protect what mattered, the legal structure, art, the corporate relationships, the trusted authority, had been carefully redirected. The irony was too precise to be anything other than a lesson. Joseph, I said, what can we do? He allowed himself a small, composed smile. The The smile of a man who has spent 31 years solving exactly this kind of problem and has never lost the satisfaction of knowing where to begin. "We act," he said, "before the deadline he set for you." For 5 days after that meeting, I behaved exactly as I always had. I came to the office every morning at the time I always arrived. I attended the meetings I was invited to and conducted them in the manner I always had, direct, attentive, neither more nor less formal than the occasion required. I reviewed the documents placed on my desk. I asked questions in the appropriate rooms. I gave no indication to Kwame or to any of the board members I passed in the corridors that anything had changed in my understanding of the situation. The discipline required for this was not as difficult as it might sound. I had spent 40 years in business navigating situations where what I was thinking and what I was showing were not the same thing. Not dishonesty. There is a difference between privacy and deception. I had simply learned, over decades, that a man who makes his position visible before he is ready to defend it gives away the only advantage that timing provides. I knew how to be in a room while also thinking beyond it. I knew how to listen to what was being said while simultaneously attending to what was not being said. I had learned this quality partly from a Boehner, who had possessed it naturally, and partly from the education that comes from 4 decades of negotiations where the visible conversation was never the only one happening. For 5 days, I performed normalcy with the discipline of a man who understands that normalcy, properly sustained, is its own kind of power. The person who seems unaware of what is happening is very difficult to move against. There is nothing to push against. The counteraction has no surface to find. Kwame seemed relaxed during those days. I watched him carefully, not obviously, not in a way that would have been legible to him, but with the particular quality of attention I reserve for things that matter. He moved through the office with the particular ease of a man whose plan is running on schedule. His manner toward me was, if anything, slightly warmer than usual. He was attentive. He came to the study one evening with a file he could easily have sent through Margaret, bringing it personally instead, making small conversation about a property development conference he had attended, checking on me, in the way a man checks on something he has already mentally moved past the active phase of worrying about. He believed the hardest part of what he was doing was already behind him. The documents were in process. The board relationships were managed. The deadline was approaching. What remained was simply the procedural completion of something already decided. He was, in the privacy of his own assessment, almost done. He had no way to know that the variable he had not accounted for was already in motion. That while he was reviewing his timeline, I was reviewing mine. And that mine, like everything important I had ever built, was built on documentation. On the morning of the 6th day, I called a board meeting, not through Kwame's office, directly through Margaret, to each board member's personal contact, the number that rang their personal assistant rather than going through the company's central communications. I had maintained these personal contacts over the years, not because I anticipated needing to circumvent any internal process, but because direct access to the people who matter is simply good practice. The kind of thing that seems unnecessary until it is essential. The invitation described it as a strategic review with the founder. No agenda attached, no briefing note, simply the meeting, the time, and the named host. I did not explain why I was calling the meeting directly, rather than through the usual channels. I did not need to. A board meeting called by the founder in his own company, using his own authority, does not require an explanation. It requires only the authority. And I still had that, entirely, regardless of what certain documents and certain conversations had been attempting to establish. 3 board members, I learned, called Kwame's office before confirming with mine. This was useful information, not because it told me anything I did not already suspect, but because it confirmed it with precision. Those 3 names went into the notebook alongside everything else. Kwame's office, I was told by 2 sources, responded to these calls with a message that the meeting was a misunderstanding that would be clarified, so that there was no need for concern, that everything was proceeding as planned. Everything was proceeding as planned. That was accurate. It simply was not his plan that was proceeding. Now we are back to where this story began, the conference room in the morning, filling with people who had built their careers inside a company I had created, from a modest office in a city that was still finding its shape. 12 board members settling into chairs around a table that I had sat at for decades, in a room with a view of a skyline that contained, if you knew where to look, the physical evidence of 45 years of work. Buildings I had financed, developments I had initiated, structures that bore the company's name and would continue to do so long after any individual at that table was finished. The conference room, the long table. 12 people who had built careers inside the company I created, looking at my son instead of at me. I had arrived before any of them. I sat at the head of the table and watched the room fill. I watched who entered with whom, who sat near whom, who avoided whose eye as they settled. These things are legible if you know how to read them. The seating arrangements of powerful people tell you the current state of their allegiances with more accuracy than almost anything they will subsequently say. Kwame arrived last, composed, leather portfolio in hand, held at the angle that signals confidence without effort. He entered the room and I saw the exact moment his eyes completed a circuit of the situation. The full table, the presence of everyone who had been called, me at the head rather than in my usual middle position. Joseph seated along the wall behind me with a folder on his knee. I saw something adjust behind Kwame's eyes in that fraction of a second. Not panic, he was too disciplined for panic, but a recalibration, the rapid silent revision of an expectation that had just encountered a reality it had not predicted. He sat at the far end of the table and opened his portfolio with a movement that was precisely calibrated to look unhurried. I opened the meeting without preamble. I thanked them for coming. I told them I would be direct. I placed Joseph's folder in the center of the table with the deliberateness of a man who has decided, finally, to name what is in the room. I told them I had reviewed documentation concerning recent changes to our corporate structure and to my personal asset holdings. I told them I had found evidence of transfers processed under a broadly written power of attorney, transfers that had not been authorized by me in the way the authorizing document had been presented to me. I told them I had been informed of governance discussions involving several people at that table that had not included my knowledge or my consent. I spoke quietly. I did not raise my voice. I had learned a long time ago that the loudest statement a man can make in a room is the one he delivers at his most ordinary volume. The room was very quiet, not the silence of people who did not know what to say, the silence of people who had known something was wrong and had been waiting, each in their own way, for someone to say it clearly enough that they could respond to it. From my left, Kwame's voice came measured and careful. "Dad, boy," he said, "I think there may be some misunderstanding about the administrative decisions that have been..." "Kwame." I said his name once. He stopped. There are moments in a man's life when a single word carries 45 years inside it, when everything accumulated across decades arrives compressed into a syllable. His name, said that way, was not a command. It was a reckoning, the quiet arrival of something that had been patient long enough. I addressed the full room. I told them that Joseph Mensah, my attorney of 31 years, was prepared to present a complete review of the relevant documentation, that in the interest of this company's integrity, and in the interest of each of their positions as directors, I was requesting that review happen today, not tomorrow, not after a weekend of private conversations, today. Thomas, one of the senior board members, a man I had known for 20 years, who had been on the board long enough to remember when we had operated out of offices a fifth of the size of these, leaned forward and asked if I was formally requesting a governance review under the company articles. "I am," I said. Agnes, who had been with the company for over a decade and who I had always valued for the quality of attention she brought to everything that passed through her hands, looked at the folder, then at Kwame, then back at me. Her expression did not change, but I had known her long enough to read what it meant. She had suspected something. She had been waiting to see whether I knew. Now she knew that I knew, and that changed everything about what her own response to the situation required. Kwame closed his portfolio slowly. There was something different in the gesture. The same gesture with a different quality inside it, like a door closing that had previously been left open. He looked at me across the table with an expression I had not seen on his face since he was a child, the look of a man who had planned carefully for every variable, except the one sitting at the head of the table, not the one he had expected to find there. "Dad," he said quietly, "this is not necessary." I met his eyes calmly. "I believe it is," I said. And it was. It was necessary not to punish him. Punishment was not what this moment required. It was necessary because the people in that room had built their professional lives around the assumption that this company was governed by principles that meant what they said. They deserved to know whether that was still true. And I deserved to have it established, clearly and formally and on the record, that I was not retired, that my authority had not been transferred, and that what had been done to my personal assets without my genuine consent was not something I was willing to quietly absorb. The meeting lasted 4 hours and 20 minutes. Joseph presented the documentation with the same methodical precision he brought to everything. The property transfers were laid out. The power of attorney was explained, its language, its scope, the gap between how it had been described to me and what it actually authorized. The board members asked questions, some of which revealed how much they had understood of what had been happening, and some of which revealed how much they had preferred not to examine too closely. Kwame said very little after the first hour. So his legal instinct, which was considerable, told him that silence was his least damaging option. He was right about that. He sat through the remaining 3 hours with the composure of a man who had decided that composure was the last thing he could preserve in that room. What emerged over the following 2 weeks was not a simple story. It was not the story of a dishonest man. It was the story of a patient one. A man who had been watching and planning and positioning for years, who had moved carefully, always with a justification ready, always within the technical boundaries of what he had been authorized to do, even as he had worked methodically to expand those boundaries beyond what anyone had agreed to. The property transfers were reversed, the power of attorney document was reviewed, formally invalidated, and replaced with a precisely limited instrument that Joseph drafted himself and that I reviewed line by line, every line. I did not sign it until I could have explained to any interested party exactly what each provision meant and what it did not. 2 board members who had been operating with the understanding that a full succession was imminent tendered their resignations quietly within the week. I accepted them without drama. They had made a calculation about which way the company was moving and had aligned themselves accordingly, and they had been wrong about the calculation. That was a professional consequence. I bore them no personal ill will. They had done what people do when the information available to them points in a certain direction. They had acted on it. The problem was not their judgment. It was the information they had been given. 3 others, Thomas and Agnes among them, came to me privately to express what they had observed over the preceding months. They described a pattern of small assurances, of impressions carefully cultivated, of a company whose center of gravity had been gradually and deliberately shifted. They were not apologetic exactly. That would have been too simple, but they were honest. And honesty, in my experience, is the beginning of trust rather than the restoration of it, because real trust was never quite lost between us. It had been obscured. The honesty brought it back into view. Kwame did not come to me for 3 weeks after the board meeting. I did not go to him either. I gave him the space to sit with what had happened. I knew from 40 years of managing people, and from the more personal knowledge that comes from being someone's father, that pressure applied too soon after a confrontation produces only defense. The walls go up, and they stay up, and the conversation you most need to have becomes impossible precisely because you try to have it before the other person was ready. Real understanding needed room to arrive in its own time. Real understanding cannot be scheduled. He knocked on the study door on a Thursday evening. 2 knocks, the way he had done since he was a boy. I recognized the sound of it immediately. Not because it was distinctive in any technical sense, but because it was his. The rhythm of it, the interval between the 2 knocks, some belonged to a particular version of him that predated the board meeting and the negotiations and the carefully positioned explanations. It was the knock of a child who wanted to enter his father's space and was asking permission properly. "Come in," I said. He sat down across from me. He looked like a man who had not been sleeping enough. There was something diminished in his posture. Not broken, not defeated, but quieter. The particular quietness of someone who has stopped performing confidence because the audience has already seen through it, and the performance no longer serves any purpose. He looked more like himself, in some ways, than he had in years. The performance had been so sustained that its absence revealed something I had missed. For a while he said nothing. I was patient. I had made tea. The pot was on the desk between us, and neither of us touched it for the first several minutes. Then, I told myself it was for the company. I waited, and for the family, for stability. I told myself that you were already stepping back in practice, that the transition was already happening informally, and that I was simply giving it a formal structure. I told myself that the timeline I was moving on was not that different from a timeline you might have moved on yourself, eventually. I told myself that the things I was doing were things that needed to be done, that someone was going to have to do them, and that doing them myself in the way I saw fit was no different in kind from what you had done at my age. He looked at his hands. I told myself a lot of things. What do you tell yourself now? I asked. He looked up. Why, his eyes were steadier than I expected. Not defiant, not pleading, honest. The particular honesty that arrives when a person has decided to stop negotiating with the truth and simply acknowledge it, that I wanted control before I had earned it. A pause, and that I convinced myself the wanting was the same as deserving. I sat with that for a moment. The precision of it, the way it named the thing exactly. A man who wanted something badly enough had found a way to tell himself that the wanting was itself a kind of entitlement, and he had believed it long enough, and consistently enough, to build an entire architecture of action on top of it. Your mother used to say something, I told him. She said the difference between a leader and a thief is not always ability. Sometimes it is simply patience. Kwame was quiet. Friday, he was listening in the way he had listened as a boy. Not to respond, but to understand. You have ability, I said. You have always had ability. That was never the question. That was never what I doubted about you. The question was always whether you were ready to receive something, or whether you were only ready to take it, because those are not the same thing. And a company built on taking rather than receiving will carry that origin in its structure, in its culture, in the way people inside it relate to each other and to the truth. There is a difference, I said, between succession and seizure. The first one requires both parties, both of them honest, both of them willing, both of them clear-eyed about what is being transferred and why and on what terms. The second one only requires one, and the second one, when it is finished, leaves behind something that looks like the first one but is built on a different foundation entirely, a foundation of deception rather than trust. And that foundation, eventually, will show. Kwame was quiet for a long moment, and then he said something that surprised me, not because it was unexpected exactly. I had known my son for 39 years, and nothing about him was entirely unexpected, but because it was true in a way that I had not let myself fully see before. I was afraid, he said quietly. Of what? I asked. He exhaled slowly. That you would live forever. And then, with a small and exhausted laugh, the laugh of a man who has finally stopped pretending, and that I would spend my whole life waiting in a corridor that never quite led anywhere, watching you run the company I had been prepared to run, being ready for something that kept not beginning. The laugh, that small, exhausted, honest laugh, did something to the room. It made it smaller. It made the distance across the desk less. I am not going to live forever, I said. He nodded. I have thought about the succession more carefully than you may realize, I told him. I have been thinking about it for years. The question was never whether to hand this over. The question was always how, and the how matters. It matters for the company, because a company that changes hands through deception, rather than through genuine agreement, carries that wound. And it matters for us, for you and me, because what you take rather than receive, you will never fully trust yourself to hold. You will always know, somewhere beneath the confidence, that it was seized rather than given. And that knowledge has a way of making a man defensive in situations that do not require defense. It makes him uncertain in moments that require certainty. It costs more than the seizure was worth. The question of when you begin, I said, has never been mine to answer alone. It was always going to require both of us at the table, both of us honest, both of us willing to say clearly what we want and what we are prepared to do to deserve it. I should have sat down with you years ago and had this conversation directly. I did not. That is my failure, and I own it. I don't know how I became someone who stopped doing that, he said quietly. Someone who decided that moving around the truth was more practical than moving through it. Gradually, I said. The way all important things change, not all at once. In layers so thin that you don't notice the accumulation until the distance between where you started and where you've arrived is large enough to surprise you. He looked at me. That is why the records matter, I said. That is why you write things down. Not because you distrust everyone around you, but because the gradual is the hardest thing to see in real time. Documentation is not suspicion. It is the antidote to gradual. We began meeting on Thursday mornings, not as chairman and director, not as founder and successor, as father and son, which is what we had always been, underneath everything, and which the preceding months had not changed, regardless of what they had damaged. I would make tea. He would arrive 10 minutes early, the way he always had for important meetings, but which told me that he was taking these Thursdays seriously in the way he took the things that mattered to him seriously. At first, the conversations were careful. We were both managing something, both navigating the particular delicacy of a relationship that has been strained and is choosing, consciously and deliberately, to move toward repair rather than away from it. There were silences that lasted longer than they needed to. There were things that neither of us raised because the timing was not yet right, but the conversations deepened, as they were bound to, between people who are willing to sit still long enough for depth to arrive, not about transactions, about the future, about what the company could be if it was built on clarity rather than assumption, when about what succession could look like if both of us approached it with our eyes open, with real documents and real conversations and real agreements rather than the comfortable vagueness of things understood but never said, about what we each wanted, not what we assumed the other wanted, not what we had told ourselves we wanted, but the actual thing underneath all the positions and the strategies and the fears. What Kwame wanted was not control in some abstract sense. What he wanted was to matter, to have his contribution visible, to not spend the best years of his professional life being the deputy of a man who showed no signs of ever moving aside. Those were legitimate wants. I could have addressed them directly, years earlier, if I had been willing to have the conversation that directness required. There were areas of the business where his understanding of current conditions genuinely exceeded mine. The digital side, the newer markets, the relationships with the generation of partners who were his contemporaries rather than mine. I listened to him. I told him when I thought he was right. I told him, honestly and directly, when I thought he was wrong. And I explained why, because he deserved a reason rather than a judgment. That was the respect that his ability had always warranted and that I had not always shown. And he did something I had not seen him do in years. He changed his mind when the argument warranted it. Not performatively, not with the visible effortfulness of a man demonstrating flexibility. Genuinely, he would listen to a counter-argument, go quiet in the way he had gone quiet as a teenager when something landed, sue and then shift. Not all the way, not always, but enough. That was the sign I had been waiting for. Not obedience, not agreement, not the deferential approval seeking of a man who has been caught and is managing his recovery. The willingness to be convinced. That is what distinguishes someone capable of leading from someone merely capable of winning. A winner can maintain a position indefinitely. A leader can absorb new information and let it change the position. Kwame had always been capable of winning. I was watching, in those Thursday mornings, the emergence of something more. Daniel, through all of it, remained steady. He said very little about what had happened. He did not need to say much. He had already said the thing that mattered most on that Friday evening in the study. Boy, he came to work every day and managed his division with the quiet competence he had always brought to it, and he waited. There is a particular kind of strength in a person who does what is right and then does not make a performance of having done it. Daniel had spoken when speaking was required. After that, he went back to his work. He did not remind me of what he had done. He did not look for the acknowledgement. He simply continued, which was, in its way, the most eloquent demonstration of the thing he had said to me in the first place. The truth, offered freely, and then not charged for. One afternoon I called him into the study and placed an envelope on the desk between us. He looked at it. Open it, I said. Inside was a letter, formal for the record, recognizing his role in what had happened. His courage in coming to me with information that must have cost him something significant, not financially, but in the currency of family loyalty, which is always more expensive than it appears from the outside. The choice to tell a father that his firstborn son is doing something wrong is not a small choice. It is the kind of choice that requires you to be willing to be resented. Daniel had made it anyway. He read the letter twice. Then he folded it carefully and put it in his breast pocket, the way you put something you intend to keep. What he said was this: Mom would have done the same thing. He was right. Abina would have. Not because she was strategic, she was not in that sense, but because she had a deep, unsentimentalized commitment to truth in the specific places where truth was most needed and most difficult, in families. When in the relationships where love makes honesty harder rather than easier, where the temptation to protect the peace by staying quiet is strongest, she would have told the truth. And she would have done it in the way Daniel did it. Not with drama, not with self-righteousness, but simply and directly, and with all the consequences accepted in advance. I miss her in this story in ways I cannot fully articulate. I miss her in all the stories, but in this one particularly, because this is exactly the kind of situation she would have known how to navigate, and because her children are, in their different ways, still navigating by what she taught them, even though they may not know they are doing it. 6 months after the board meeting, Joseph completed the new holding structure. It took time because we did it correctly. But that is the only measure that matters for documents of this kind. Not speed, not elegance, not the kind of efficiency that looks impressive in a presentation. Correctness. The personal properties were clearly delineated from the corporate assets, with language specific enough to survive any subsequent interpretive creativity. The governance documents were rewritten with language that left nothing to interpretation. Not because we expected bad faith, but because good governance does not rely on good faith. It provides for it and then provides for when it is absent. The succession plan, real this time, mutual, transparent, reviewed by both my sons and by the relevant board members, was formalized in writing and filed properly. It was not a simple document. It described not just the transfer of authority, but the conditions under which that transfer would occur, the timeline, the performance benchmarks, the governance protections that would remain in place throughout. It was the document I should have insisted on years earlier, before grief and trust and the comfortable avoidance of difficult conversations had left the field open for something less transparent to take its place. Both Kwame and Daniel were present for the signing. The conversation before it was honest, not entirely comfortable. Some of the honesty came from places that were still a little tender, but honest. The kind of conversation that costs something and produces something worth the cost. The morning I signed the final documents, I asked everyone to leave the room for a few minutes. The room went quiet around me. I sat with the documents in front of me and the pen in my hand and the city visible through the window. The city that had been building itself alongside the company for 45 years, changing and expanding and complicating in the way that cities do, carrying within it the invisible infrastructure of 10,000 private decisions made by people who were trying, each in their own way, to build something that mattered. I thought about Abana. I thought about the question she had asked me at that dinner, which had been the first question, and in some ways the most important one. Security for who? I thought about the answer I had found over the following 4 decades, an answer that was not one thing but many things, and that had changed its shape as the years changed around it. Security for my family, for the people who worked here, for the communities the company touched, for the idea that something built on honest dealing and genuine effort can survive its builder. I thought about the early years of the business, when we had nothing but the confidence in my voice and the stubbornness in Abana's character and the sense, shared between us, that we were building something that mattered. The late nights in a small office that smelled of carbon paper and possibility. The conversations at the kitchen table when the boys were asleep and Abana would sit across from me and ask me what I was actually trying to do, in the particular way she had of stripping away the business language and finding the human intention underneath it. I thought about what my father wrote in that small careful hand, all those years ago. We're in the kitchen of a house that is no longer standing in a city that has become unrecognizable around its absence. Everything you build should be able to outlast you. He did not mean money. He never meant money. My father was a precise man, and if he had meant money, he would have written money. He meant something harder to hold and harder to pass on than capital. He meant the values that shaped the decisions, the relationships built on honesty rather than convenience, the capacity to look at the people you love and tell them the truth, even when the truth is inconvenient, the willingness to protect what matters not with silence and trust alone, but with documentation and clarity, and the ongoing difficult work of saying out loud what you mean. Those things, properly cared for, do outlast us. They outlast the buildings and the accounts and the corporate structures. They survive in the way the people we shaped survive us, in their choices, in their instincts, in the small moments when they do the right thing, not because anyone is watching, but because it has become the only thing they know how to do. I signed the documents. I took a long breath. I called the room back in. There is something I want to say before this story ends. I do not tell this story to condemn my son. I tell it because it is true, and because true stories, when they are told honestly, have a way of being useful to people who are living adjacent versions of the same thing. And I suspect that some of you, perhaps more of you than I realize, are living adjacent versions of this story right now. You are the father watching a handover move in a direction you did not authorize. Or you are the son who has been moving faster than the runway allows. Or you are the Daniel, the one who sees clearly and is trying to decide whether the cost of saying what you see is one you are willing to pay. Kwame is not a villain. He is a man who was given a great deal, who watched that great deal grow into something enormous, and who slowly, without fully realizing it was happening, began to confuse proximity with ownership. He made decisions that were wrong. He caused real harm. Those things are true, and acknowledging them is not optional. They must be named. But they are not the whole truth. The whole truth is that I also failed him. Not by giving him too much. I do not believe that is where parents fail their children. I failed him by giving without making the giving visible. By absorbing the costs of his mistakes so completely that he never fully understood they existed. By treating my own sacrifice as so natural, so unremarkable, that he eventually stopped seeing it at all. When people cannot see the foundation beneath them, they begin to assume the ground simply exists. They stop asking who built it, who maintains it, what it cost. They begin to act as though the floor will always hold, regardless of what they do to it. And I had, over decades of protecting him from the weight of what I was carrying, removed his ability to feel the floor. What I should have done, what I would do differently, if I had those years again, is make the conversation explicit, not transactional, not the kind of conversation that keeps a tally and presents the bill. But honest. I should have sat with both my sons and said, clearly and repeatedly and without discomfort, this is what your mother and I built. This is what it required of us. This is what it continues to require of everyone who benefits from it. And this is what we need from you, not as a condition of love, but as the basic terms of mutual responsibility. That conversation, had early enough and repeated often enough, might have changed everything. It might have given Kwame a container for his ambition that did not require deception. It might have given Daniel a clearer sense of his own importance to the enterprise. It might have given me a less painful education in the cost of avoidance, but I did not have it, and so we had to have a harder one later. In a conference room with a lawyer and a table full of people who had to learn alongside us. That is the cost of avoidance. It does not eliminate the necessary conversation. It only makes it more expensive. It charges interest on the delay. It adds complexity and damage and time that could have been spent building rather than repairing. Every difficult conversation you defer becomes, eventually, a more difficult conversation. This is a law as reliable as any in the universe. I have seen it hold across 45 years, and I have never found an exception. Families are complicated. Love does not prevent conflict. Anyone who has been loved well and loved honestly knows that love is precisely the condition under which the most difficult conflicts arise, because the stakes are higher, because the history is deeper, because the other person knows exactly where you are most vulnerable and you know exactly where they are. Love does not prevent conflict. What love can do, when it is practiced honestly, when it is not used as a reason to avoid hard truths, is create the conditions for repair. And repair, when it is genuine, in a creatus of righteous be, produces something stronger than what existed before. Not because damage is good, but because the process of addressing it honestly builds a form of trust that comfort alone cannot produce. If there is one lesson I hope this story leaves with you, it is this. Never confuse silence with peace. In a family, in a business, in any relationship where something valuable exists, silence is not the same as agreement. Silence is not the same as trust. Silence is the condition in which misunderstanding grows undetected, in which assumptions accumulate unchallenged, in which the distance between what two people believe about a situation can expand over years until it is too large to bridge without a crisis. The things that matter most must be spoken. They must be recorded. They must be protected. Not because the people around you are untrustworthy, but because trust without structure is a burden too heavy for any person to carry alone. We do not ask people we trust to carry heavy loads without support. We build the support so that the trust can function properly. That is what documents are for. That is what honest conversations are for. That is what the kind of succession planning that neither party avoids is for. Say the things, write them down, sign them, review them, and then do it again next year. Because circumstances change and agreements must change with them. And to those of you who recognize yourselves in Kwame, who have perhaps, in a moment of pressure or fear or impatience or ambition, reached further than you had the right to, hear this too. Walk back into the room. Sit down and tell the truth. This is directed specifically to those of you who told yourself a story about it that made the reaching feel not just acceptable, but necessary, who moved in ways that, if you were honest with yourself in this moment, you would not be entirely comfortable describing accurately to the person who trusted you. It is not too late to turn around. Not in most cases. Not in the cases where the other person still loves you, which is most cases. The turning is hard, the conversation is harder. But the alternative, continuing in the direction you have been going, adding justification to justification until the original wrong is so deeply buried that you can no longer find it, that alternative is harder still. And it costs you, in the end, the thing you were trying to secure. Because what you take rather than receive, you will never fully trust yourself to hold. Because the people who love you are, in most cases, still waiting. They are waiting in the way that people wait when they still believe in the possibility of the person they know. They are holding the space open. They are leaving the door slightly ajar. They are choosing, each day, to not yet close what could still be reopened. That is a gift of extraordinary value. Do not waste it by being too proud to cross the threshold. If this story moved you, I want to hear from you right now, not because I want something from you in the transactional sense, but because these stories, the real ones, the ones that carry the weight of actual experience, are only fully complete when they land somewhere, when they meet something in the person receiving them, when the truth of them connects with a truth the listener already knew but had not yet put into words. So tell me, drop a comment below and tell me, have you ever been in a situation where someone you trusted tried to take something that was yours? Or have you ever been the one who reached too far, who told yourself a story that made the reaching feel justified until the day it no longer did? Your story matters. It matters to me, and it matters to the people who will read it. We learn from each other in this particular kind of community in ways that nothing else quite replicates. If this is the kind of storytelling that speaks to you, please like this video right now. It takes 1 second and it helps more people find these stories. People who need to hear them, who are sitting with their own version of this weight right now and do not know that what they are feeling has been felt before and survived and grown into something better than what preceded it. Share it with someone who needs to hear it today. You know who that person is. You probably thought of them already, somewhere in the middle of this story. And if you're not subscribed yet, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. There are many more stories coming. Stories about family, about wealth, about loyalty, and about the quiet moments when a person's true character finally steps into the light. Stories about the choices people make in the dark, and about the choices that bring them back. About the architecture of legacy and the cost of its neglect. About the things we owe the people who built the ground beneath our feet, and about what it means to build ground that someone else can stand on. These are the stories that matter. They have always mattered. They will continue to matter long after any particular transaction or any particular year's numbers are forgotten. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening to this one. I will see you in the next one.